I think we're finally ready for it. I haven't played the full game yet, but this is going to be the intro to all of Dragon Pass. Just to get it out of the way and up. This gives me a kind of interesting opportunity that I don't usually get. So, with more complex games that I'm familiar with, and I guess this kind of applies to that, sometimes I don't go over the rules inch by inch, and that's what I'm going to do here. There's sort of a PI, programmed instruction type introduction in each of the different games, because that's how I was learning the game and am learning the game. But now I know most, if not all, of the rules to the game. So let's skim through what we've got here. First of all, this is a game that, well, I was always into Glorantha. I always wanted to get this, but it never showed up at the place where I bought my RuneQuest stuff, which was a little toy store. Had some TSR, Avalon Hill. It actually had some Chaosium without any question, but they didn't carry any of the Chaosium board games ever, so I didn't get to see Arkham Horror when it first came out. And in terms of, you know, things like Elric, that showed up under, I didn't get that until it came out as Avalon Hill. This was out as an Avalon Hill game, I think, at the time. It could have shown up there, but it never did. And I had never seen it, which is kind of shocking. And that was the only place that I knew that had Chaosium games. But I really wanted it because, A, it sounded like a cool war game based on a fantasy theme, something that there were very, very few of. The only thing that I can really say at that time that I had was Albion, the SPI one, and that's got some significant flaws. There's plenty of fantasy games, but none that are really seriously detailed war games for the most part. Some lighter war game-ish things. Okay, so here's your sequence of play. Basically, you're going to have in the full game these four main segments. A diplomacy segment, I'll explain that briefly. Basically, there's a number of neutral major powers that players are going to be getting a regular amount of points for, and they'll be using this major independence table. And what they need to do is exceed their enemy by the number of diplomatic points that is listed here. So, for example, if you wanted to ally the Dragonewts, you would have to have at least 45 more points than your opponents there. The problem is these are secretly applied. You write them down. So, if I declare, hey, I've got 45 points on the Dragonewts, you can say, that's not enough. And if you say that, then you have to be truthful. But if you had even just 1 point, that wouldn't be enough. Then you get a 5-point bonus for me having failed on them. On the other hand, if I have at least as many more as needed, I'll get this new major power on the board. And there are a number of these. The Black Horses, the Grazelanders, Wintertop, those are the Exiles, the Dragonewts, which are not there, all over the board, actually, and they're connected by these kind of mystical roads that they can travel for. Crag Spider, who's up here with a dragon and some trolls. There's got to be more of these. The Beast Valley. To see if there's more. That looks like it. Okay. There's also a bunch of neutrals on the board already that you see here. These are ones that are going to be, you have to send a specific emissary to them, and you'll be rolling a die in order to provide the emissary's results. That'll be on this emissary table, and you might either get control of them, or in the worst case, they may kill the emissary that you send, which would kind of suck. Okay, then you go to the random events phase, and this is an optional rule, but basically you roll an 11 to 66, see what happens here. It could bring weird stuff onto the board. It could affect the weather. It could do all kinds of things. Then we go to the player turns, which is the meat of the game, and this is applicable to all the scenarios. Those first two steps are only applicable to the larger scenarios. In fact, the diplomacy is only the 2-player larger scenarios. There's a 3-player scenario in the game. The basic ordering of the sequence of play, I haven't seen units that players control that are subject to random movement, but whatever. I know giants and such might be. Alliance phase is when you'd use the emissaries, I guess. Oh, it's also when you declare the diplomacy points that you've released, that you've put into play. So that gives kind of an advantage to the second player because he might have traps laid for the first player there. The movement phase, you're allowed to move your units. Now, for the most part, movement is pretty much like any other wargame. The problem is the terrain effects chart is listed here. Now, I've made my own copy of it in a more condensed and readable form because this actually takes up more than one page and it's kind of hard to find because it's all just spelled out in kind of paragraph form instead of a chart form. I find this gives me most of the information on it. For movement, well, a lot of stuff's 1 movement point. Forests, marshes, these are 2. Mountains, there are very few mountains. They're kind of hard to distinguish from hills, but they cost 3. Roads, the primary road is going to cost a half movement point each. The secondary road's a little weird. Basically, if you're walking along the secondary road, the first 2 movement points you spend on it are normal, and then you get a freebie to spend on it if you spend 2 in a row. And that continues on throughout your movement points. The movement point allowances on the units, most of the foot units are going to be 3, maybe 4 movement point for light. I'll explain the units in a little while, but here's the 4. And mounted units run between 4 and 6, generally. Okay. Speaking of which, let's take a look at a unit and see what it's composed of. A unit's composed of a number of different pieces of information. Up here is their regular combat strength. That little asterisk there indicates that it's got some missile armaments. We'll talk about them at some point. This is its magical strength. Its magical strength doesn't give any offensive capabilities unless it also has a magical range down here. And over here will be its movement allowance. On the back side of the counter is a disrupted side. You only really get there through certain magical effects and normally through the archery table. Okay. Then there's a special exotic phase where you're able to do certain kinds of exotic magic. You can send your assassins out at this point. They're allowed to scout and maybe kill off a unit. And then you hit the combat phase. Combat is particularly complex in this game, and each type, there are several different types of combat. I think 4 different aspects to the combat phase, and each type of them is subtly different from the others, even though they share some common aspects perhaps on the combat table in some cases. And then you go to a rally phase. Largely what happens here is if you took a disruption, that's interesting, I didn't play with that before, and it wasn't just this game turn, you recover from it. So you're always boned in a disruption. If you attack during a game turn, you're damaged. You remain disrupted even past that. That's going to be hard for me to remember because disrupted is basically flipped over, and how do you remember which units got disrupted this turn, which ones got disrupted earlier? I may continue to ignore that roll just for ease of play. Okay. Looking at the pieces again for a moment. There's a lot of complex little symbols on all the pieces. They all have different important, or in some cases completely unimportant, in the case of supporting the chaparral, whatever that is. That's from a different game in the system, but they wanted to use a consolidated rules series set for them. Even though the booklet of this rules has specific rules for all the different specific special critters in the game. Therefore, they would have to come up with a new rule book. They didn't make a basic rule book and an advanced, a scenario specific exclusive rule book. Nah, they made one big rule book, so they were gonna have to edit it anyway. They didn't have to put all the symbols in from the other games that they weren't going to include in here. Unless, of course, see, the games link together. That's the problem, is that the boards actually link together. So some of these things would be able to interfere perhaps on other boards. They made 2 of the games and then remade this one. Never made the 3rd one, never remade the 2nd one to match with this. You know, it's kind of sad. I wish somebody would finish up the board games here, especially just converting over Nomad Gods into this format to fit nicely with it. Just say fuck it, you know. We wanna finish what we did. Well, it never got done. Okay, some of the units have. We'll talk about that a little later. Okay, so let's talk about combat. Combat happens basically when you have zones of control in this game, and they're locking zones in the sense that if you move next to, well, they're sticky zones. If you move next to a unit, you're stuck next to it, and you have to stop your movement. If you start next to a unit with a zone of control, you can move out of the zone of control, but not from one to the other. Okay, for combat, which is sort of the complex, the meat of the game in a lot of ways, you're going to first declare where your combats are. Now, one form of combat is spirit combat, where you have these kind of white counters. They're going to be associated with a mage, and the mage can basically project these out. It's not absolutely clear when this happens. Some people think it happens during the combat phase itself. I think it happens prior to that you launch the spirits out to go do things, but it's not, like I said, it's not specified in the rules exactly when it's supposed to happen. So there's room for ambiguities in these rules. There's no question there. Okay, so you declare where all your combats are, and essentially you do actually have to attack. Combat is mandatory in most cases. The one exception to that is there's fortresses and stockades, which are considered fortified spaces, and zones of control don't influence into those, which means you're allowed to attack out of them, and if you do, you have to attack everything around you. But if you choose not to, you can stay in them and be safe. Unfortunately, you're only allowed to have 3 major units in them. That 3 major units is a concept that should be clarified. It is 3 units with an unparenthesized combat strength. Okay, a parenthesized combat strength, like this guy has, indicates that it is just a single person, basically, or a small group. So it can fit in a fortress without any problem. Okay. So then combat's going to be divided first into chaotic magic. There are some critters out here that have such weird abilities that, well, they're chaos creatures. They're going to have a negative magic power. This is an indication of one such. It's upside down, but its magic value is -N. That's a die roll. That's determined at the beginning, the first time when it's actually encountered, what that number is going to be. That allows it to kill that many opposing units that are in combat with it immediately. Some restrictions, things like superheroes are not affected by this, dragons aren't affected by this, and dragons and superheroes have this ability to kind of protect other critters. Okay. Then we go to physical magic. There are some critters in the game. Here's an example of one. I don't know who owns this. I'm going to have to figure that out. I haven't figured it out yet. CC. I think it's the Cannon Cult. Yeah. Okay. So this is a physical magic. Actually, it's a cannonball flying at you. It has a range. You place it on the map along with the spirits, and that's why the range is important. Some people see that as a spotting requirement, though. And then it has a physical combat strength. You add up all your physical spirits combat strength, not regular units that are hitting a hex. You roll a die on this combat table. Now, this combat table is basically just a firepower table, and what it distills is this ratio here, rounded down. Or this result set, rounded down. So if you roll a 2, you're going to effectively be doing a quarter of your combat strength to the opponent. Now, how the casualties are inflicted in the various circumstances is different for each type of magic, or each type of combat. In the case of spirit attacks, the damage results are inflicted by the attacker on defending units of his choice. There may be some units that are immune to them. We won't worry about that. I don't think anything's immune to physical spirits, actually. Then we go to spirit magic. This is where the normal magic in the game, where you have these kind of little things, which are your magical spirits. They'll all be white, and they have a disrupted side for some reason or another, but I guess that's if the mage is disrupted. I don't know. Okay, so the way they work is you add up all your magical strength, or magical combat factors, which is the upper right number there. And again, that gives you something on the firepower table. Now, the defender has defensive possibility here. He could also have spirits in the hex that he placed there at the end of his turn. And that's kind of a special ability that the mages have. Or he could have mages who don't have their spirits on the map at all, in which case, over in these holding boxes or whatever, in which case those mages have their defensive magical strength as something that they get to fight back with. Most units in the game don't get to fight back magically, but they have a magical strength anyway, just because they're resistant. So this, for example, has a magical strength of 1. That doesn't mean it gets to fire, it gets to add anything on these tables, but what it means is it takes casualties based on that. Over with the physical spirit, the casualties are taken against the combat factors, and the attacker chooses an amount of combat factors up to but not exceeding the amount of damage he did. Okay. Spirit attacks work the same way, except that both people get to fire at the same time, essentially. The attacker and defender. Now, the defender may not have any combat factors that he can attack back with. If his mages have their spirits on the board somewhere else, or if he has nothing that has a range factor for its combat. So, for example, this does not have a range factor for its spirit combat, so it does not get to fight back, whereas this guy, with a 0 range factor, gets his magical factor just as a defensive bonus on him. And a magician would have a range factor as to how far he can put the spirit out. If his spirit's not on the board, he gets his defensive factor. Whether or not, at least as far as I can see, whether or not his spirit's been destroyed before in a previous turn. As long as he's not attacking with his bound spirits. Okay, so when you do the magical combat, both people basically roll at once. The attacker determines and makes his die roll first. Not that that matters much, but the casualties are then assigned based on the amount of damage that both people did at the same time. The attacker has to assign his damage first, but the defender got all his defensive points and gets to roll with his full strength on defense. Okay. Then after spirit magic, and again, superheroes, dragons, and such, they can protect a certain number of units from spirit magic. They can't do it from the physical magic. After that, we go to missile fire. Missile fire is based on these little asterisks here. If you have little asterisks and you're next to an enemy unit, you count up the number of asterisks that you want to put against the hex where there are enemies, and you roll on this table. A little different from the other combat tables. The defender gets to fire first all the time. And the results are generally disruption results. The enemy unit that's being fired on or stacked has to take a certain number of disruptions. The person being fired on chooses which units to be disrupted. In some cases, there's eliminated. That indicates that units are actually eliminated. And if you have multiple disruptions, if you disrupt a unit that's already disrupted, it is eliminated. So that gives the person receiving the fire a choice when he gets a 2DD. Does he want to take a loss of a unit, or does he want to disrupt 2 units? And yeah, hard choice sometimes. Okay. Finally, we go to the melee combat. And this is really intriguing. The attacker sums up his combat capability, rolls on the chart, and applies all his results before the defender gets to. But whatever stack is being attacked, or stacks, you can only hit the top units on the stack, which means, and this is going to be taken against combat factor, which means a character like this superhero here with a physical combat factor of 20 is going to be particularly hard to hurt. Now, let's go to terrain effects on combat. Terrain effects, missiles, physical magic, and melee. On missiles, it's going to be a die roll modifier. That's just going to affect this. There are some units which give you a plus on there. For example, if there's herds in the stack, they're going to be really easy to hit. Unfortunately, they also provide cover for the units that are there. So shooting at stacks with herds generally just scares the herds away because you can't actually kill them usually. Okay. For physical magic and for melee, you get a multiplier generally times the combat factor for casualties. That indicates that each casualty taken is going to cost the person who's got damage points to allocate more. So, let's find if Jar Eel here, if she's in the hills, well, we look up hills. Don't worry, in at least one of the scenarios, I read those as mountains instead of hills because I wasn't thinking too carefully. She will be worth 1.5 times her combat factor to damage, which means it takes 30 points to damage her if she's in that decent terrain. Obviously, it'll take 40 points if she's in a fortress. So she can be these superheroes can be very, very powerful at preventing any damage to any of their units. Basically, they're just so capable. Melee is also the one place where leadership comes into play. That's those exclamation points here. Basically, she's going to give an extra strength point to every unit that's stacked with her, who's not also a leader, for each exclamation point she has. Okay. So then after the attacker rolls their melee result and it's inflicted on the defender, the defender then, with whatever's left, gets to shoot back on the combat tables under the same circumstances. Let's keep looking. Okay. Heroes and superheroes, like I've said, they have some special cases. The biggie is they're really, really potent, but they have a possibility even when killed to survive that. They roll a saving throw, essentially. Heroes have a 50-50 chance of coming back. Superheroes, 2/3. Superheroes are invulnerable to most forms of magic. They can't be taken as casualties, and they can also extend their protection over 3 other units. Superheroes have a best friend, usually. If you kill their best friend, a little scapegoat marker shows up on the unit judged to have killed it. And now the superhero flips over. Yeah, this wasn't clear to me when I first, but it's obvious in the rules. Let's find her. Flips over, has different stats. She doesn't have any disrupted side. Higher movement, a ranged magical attack, which isn't terribly explained how you use that, but I'm assuming she can just fire off a spirit attack, even though she doesn't have a spirit there at range 1. And of course, she loses her leadership ability. She's too crazed to actually lead troops anymore. The superhero, and there's like 3 of them in the game, I think. 1 for each side, and then 1 neutrally aligned one in the base game. 3, 1 for each side in the 3-player version, and yeah, that'll do. There's some different permutations of them, but anyway, the restriction on the superhero going berserk is they have to chase down the unit that killed their friend until they kill it, until it's dead somehow, and that can distract and rip a superhero out of your combat normal needs. They tend to have quite a bit of movement, so they can usually get their attack off, but they might be out of position to support your other attacks. Your other units may not be able to follow them, etc. Now, one thing I didn't go over with all these different symbols that is kind of important Okay, let's look at some of these. So this one's invulnerable to attacks from the spirit plane. That's what the superheroes have on their normal side. Over here are different movement abilities. So for example, these can walk on water. This unit flies, normal 1 point movement cost for everything. Moves over mountains and ridge lines as if they're clear terrain, stuff like that. Some of them can change the movement factors for other units. One interesting symbol is this, which can be either on magic or combat factor, and could actually conceivably, I could see a movement factor actually being that under certain circumstances, but we won't talk about that for a little while. That's based on the lunar timetable. Every turn, this is going to move forward, and it indicates the base magic factors that all the units and almost all of the units that have this variable value are affected by the lunar moon cycle. So when the moon is full, your strength will be 7, or magical strength, but when it's at its worst, it'll be down to 3. So those units have a very variable combat factor or magic factor. Except within the glow line, this big pink area, unless it gets disabled by like taking furthest, they have full strength. And then there's one more thing. There's the giant bat, which provides a little glow spot of 2 hexes around it that counts the same as the glow line does, this big area here. The bat has its own little thing. Now the bat's interesting on its own. On the dying and black cycle, you have to feed the bat. I'm in some disputes with people as to how this works. The way I'm playing it is you either have to sacrifice one of your units on each of those days, or you have to win a combat with the bat involved in the combat there. And by win, I mean you have to kill an enemy unit. There is an advance after combat. I didn't explain that. If you clear the enemy's hex and you're attacking, you can advance into that hex. There's even a breakthrough capability if you have fast mounted units, basically, where you can go an extra hex, as long as there aren't zones involved once on your first advance. Anyway, you have to feed the bat on the dying and black days each. If you don't do that, there's this bat hunger table, and this is where the dispute happens. Basically, the rules have an italicized version of making it seem like you only can feed it your own troops if you don't feed it on those 2 days. I disagree with that for matters having to do with Glorantha more than anything else, and the subject matter of the book, of the storyline. But basically, you can, under my playing, feed it with enemy units during these other periods as well. And what happens is each day that you haven't fully fed the bat, your requirements keep going up. So it's like this sort of Damocles over your head. If you choose not to feed it out to or if you're unable to feed it out to here and choose not to sacrifice your own units, you have a really high number of units you have to sacrifice to the bat. Now, if you get to the full phase and you still haven't fed it, well, you must. If you don't, the bat dies and it goes off and eats your units. So, therefore, you do feed it, but that can be difficult because you might not get the units up to it to sacrifice. Okay. So, the bat is one of the more exciting pieces, but there are a lot of exciting pieces in this game. Basically, there's several pages of specific units that are all have individual special rules. And to not be aware of these special rules means that you're going to screw up play significantly. You're not going to take the best advantage of the game. A lot of the game is taking advantage of these specialized units. Every player has basically, the 2 major factions and then at least one of the minor factions, Crag Spider, I think maybe another one, have these abilities that allow you to take out a big hunk of the enemy's forces. As far as I can tell, every one of them is a one-shot, although most of them define it as you basically give up your magical spirit in order to perform the attack. At least one of them, it seems to just be a once per game without affecting the spirit. You have these weird things like dinosaurs running around, which will join whoever they stack with, but then if you leave them alone, they go off and just kind of do what they want to do. You have undead here that form this powerful chain of units that's sort of geometric progression in terms of if you have one, well, not really, but the sum of all the power of the zombies ends up adding together for each hex that there are zombies in. It just looks scary. I haven't seen it in play yet. Dragon Newts have their special little roads. They have these magic roads connecting their cities. Their cities are these weird kind of shifting places, and they're scattered all over the board. And they basically have their own secret roads that they can travel on, but they are affected by zones from outside of it. You have the dwarf up here who, if you go talk to him, he might give you a cannon or something cool, or he might just join you instead and leave all his cool toys away. You have this giant jack-o'-lantern that can pull other units towards it. It should also have an effect on preventing spirit magic, but these puppeteers all over here who can, there's many of them, and they can shift from space to space. These are all neutrals that have these special abilities set up for them. I feel like I'm missing something, but I think that's basically the core of it. This is a game that I feel like you really kind of have to study it and play a lot of it to really get all the interactions in it, but it is still fun and more detailed and specialized than most war games out there. Because of the magical abilities of units, everything, so many units have their own special ability in this game. And that's both its beauty and perhaps its drawback in terms of being able to approach it easily. There is a set of scenarios, and I've played each one kind of in turn, skipped a couple here and there, but that allow you to kind of get used to this because, like I said, the combat system is not normal for most games. You know, this is very unique, and especially with all those very unique. It's just unique. Okay, fair enough. Other people's habits brushing off on me. It takes some getting used to and layering the different types of combat where each has its own little different rules. Again, I would point at that and say, wow, that's kind of a weird design decision that I feel makes the game harder to cope with. But honestly, it all works together in a really, really neat way. I'll say more about that when I actually review the game, but I figured I'd give you some of this at least now.